Well, hello, friends. So today we're going to be talking about Chapter 8, which is the federal involvement in education, which is fairly limited. All right, so that's the good news. We don't have a large federal involvement in K through 12 education, but what we have is fairly substantial for school corporations. So let's go ahead and get started here and take a look at Chapter 8. Hope everybody's having a good day. It's sun shining here. It's what is today? August 31st. So like I said, I've been flying the plane and building it at the same time as I took over the 684 classes, and I'm still doing the 685, which is a lot of fun. So if you want to learn about school budgets, 685 will be your cup of tea. So I'm hoping some of you will join me on that journey as well. But today we're going to take a look at federal involvement in education. Let me set up my PowerPoint here. You guys know the drill. I say that every time, don't I? So here we go. Let's see. All right, so Chapter 8 is federal interest in education. So let's take a look at our learning objectives. We're going to trace the development of the federal aid to education from its beginning to the present position. You know, where'd all this government money come from? Discuss general federal aid, block grants, and categorical federal aid in terms of the advantages and disadvantages of each type of grant. Review information on land grants by the federal government and indicate the current status of these lands. List the U.S. presidential policy proposals for public schools, and briefly discuss ESEA, Title I, Every Student Succeeds Act, and so forth, as well as IDEA, and so that you can begin to understand how some schools get some of this aid. All right. So let's continue that. Let's go here. So as we begin to look at federal involvement, the term federalism comes up, right? So federalism is the division of authority between the state level of government and the federal level of government. So remember, we've got local involvement in education, generally through property tax collections. You've got state involvement in education in Indiana, primarily through income and sales taxes. And we're talking about revenue here because, again, school finance class takes money in order to have education. And then you've got federal involvement in education, which is a small piece, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But all of this, again, remember, education is not mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. I want to say that again. Education is not mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. Therefore, friends, where does it go? Back to the states under the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. Can't stress this enough. The 10th Amendment, and that all the states in their own constitutions have a reference to education. So education primarily, again, can't stress this enough, is a state function. All right. And federal and state courts have judged education to be a state responsibility. So how much federal aid is available to the states? Well, typically it's about 8% of all public schooling. And as you begin to do your project looking at 3 different states and how they fund education, you'll see that some will be a little bit more, some will be a little bit less. And again, typically it's going to fall back to the wealth of each individual state. So the sources of support vary by states. Every state's going to get something a little different. So that'll be interesting for you. At least I think it will, to find out how much does this state get compared to this state in terms of federal involvement, and what is the state share? What is the local share? So the share of total finances that the federal government provides to individual states varies widely, ranging from 3.5% in Connecticut, wealthier state, to 19% in Mississippi. Less wealthy state, right? Most federal K through 12 funding supports the nation's most vulnerable students through 2 primary avenues. So you've got the National School Lunch Program, of which most public schools are involved with. And there's all these strings attached in terms of the school lunch program. Matter of fact, for the past 2 years, the National School Lunch Program during the pandemic had been for all students. And you're certainly likely aware of that. That program is being phased out. So there's a lot of controversy right now about how are parents going to come up again with that, you know, $20 a week or whatever it costs in order to provide lunches to their kiddos at the same time as we're talking about inflationary measures and so forth. So the post-pandemic life right now is a little dicey for a lot of folks as we hopefully move beyond the pandemic. And so that'll continue to be a discussion. And of course, you got the Title I program, which provides funding to schools serving low-income students. And some of you may be Title I schools out there. So the Title I program is looking more at poverty. And then finally, you do have special education, IDEA, which again is a federal program to help provide services for our special education students. However, realize that the federal government at one time promised, I think it was up to 40% of aid to states, and we've never even come close to that at all. Probably more like in the neighborhood of 15 to 16% from the federal government helping out states, if that much. I have not checked out that percentage recently, but just know that this is one of those with the special education. It's an unfunded mandate, right? So we have all these court rulings, we have laws and so forth to protect special education students, which we should, but states and local entities are primarily picking up the biggest share, even though the mandate, as a result of some federal government legislation back in the 60s and 70s. So in short, federal funds make up a small proportion of total funding for U.S. K-12 education. Just remember, right around that 8%. But those funds are badly needed for kiddos who have some living in poverty or have some learning differences. So there are very, very, very important programs. And then, of course, nutrition for our nation's kiddos. So what has the historical role been in education? So for the most part, 8%, been pretty minor, right? The federal role in education was relatively minor until the revision of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 2001, No Child Left Behind Act. We continue to get more and more federal involvement and more mandates and more strings attached to monies. But for the most part, it's pretty minor, but significant. You know, the school lunch program is pretty darn significant to feed the nation's kiddos. This legislation expanded federal control to most schools and school districts across the nation. We also have the U.S. Department of Education, which is very controversial. And why would it be controversial? Because it's a cabinet level position that was created, but it's not a part of the Constitution, right? So it was created in 1979 during the Carter administration. Although it still says the primary responsibility goes back to the states, we do have there's a voice there at the federal level, which has changed depending upon who the president is and what the objectives of that particular administration are. So it hasn't been real consistent in terms of philosophy, programs, so forth, expectations. Very political. So when we look at educational policies in history, we need to go back really to the Truman administration, the Eisenhower administration. That was even before I was born, believe it or not. So, well, the Truman administration was, I'm really old. But Truman and Eisenhower advocated federal funds for education. Of course, you had the GI Bill coming out after World War II. You had school integration, Brown versus Board of Education. 1954, you had federal troops to Little Rock to enforce integration. So federal government really started getting involved here a little bit in the 50s and 60s. Prior to that, again, more state and even more local control prior to that time, because remember, you had all these schools all over the country. The Kennedy administration advocated federal funding for both public and parochial schools. You had the race to space that was going on at that time. So, you know, if you've ever seen the movie The Right Stuff, that's a great movie to see in terms of what was going on during this time period in that race for space. So I'd recommend that movie. That's a fun little movie. It's a little long, about 3 hours, but it's a fun movie. I highly recommend. It's one of my favorite movies of all time. Now I'm on a tangent on it. So, but remember that Kennedy advocated funding for both public and parochial schools. Remember, Kennedy was Catholic. Does that tie into what he was trying to do? Probably. And you had, of course, the race to space, which was the most important piece there. Then you had Lyndon Johnson, good old Texan, good old Lyndon Johnson, who honestly, if the Vietnam War, I'm a historian just by fun because I used to teach history, right? I truly believe Lyndon Johnson would be, and he might have his face up there on Mount Rushmore if it wasn't been for the Vietnam War. If you ever get a chance to read his biography, I highly recommend it. Johnson was a towering figure, and he couldn't survive in today's political climate because he typically, I mean, he pulled people in and got the Southern Democrats at that time to compromise on a lot of integration activities, legislation that was going on, built schools, libraries, and enacted the Secondary and Education Act, opened up civil rights in this country. Unbelievable, the things that he was able to accomplish, because he had one time had been a senator, and he knew the levers to push and the people he could count on to get legislation passed. And I'm telling you, Lyndon Johnson, LBJ, was a good president, except for one area, and the Vietnam War was so controversial, it just kind of pushed him off to the side. And we don't talk about LBJ enough, but a lot of the programs and things that we see are a direct result of good old LBJ. Jimmy Carter established the Department of Education, so you can thank Jimmy for that. Our good old peanut farmer there, he established Department of Education, and it's very controversial still to this day. You'll hear, generally the GOP saying, we need to abolish the Department of Education. And it's a philosophical difference. They want to revert back to the states, obviously, everything. So notice there, Ronald Reagan called for the elimination of the Department of Education. So right away, Reagan gets elected after Carter and wants to eliminate it. We've had that discussions ever since. And in particular, during the Reagan administration is where we again began to say, oh, public schools aren't doing the job, and the nation at risk. So if you want to have any background and understanding education historically, go back and read A Nation at Risk. I think it's 1983. You can see why federal involvement has begun to creep in both parties, both Republicans and Democrats, after A Nation at Risk. Bill Clinton, Goals 2000 legislation, codified goals and standards. So again, we begin to continue to talk about federal involvement in our schools, and George Bush took that a little further. And I liked old George, but man, education policy, No Child Left Behind, where, every child was expected to pass standardized tests, or there were going to be these penalties, was, as we both know, standardized tests. Some students, unfortunately, are not going to reach that bar, and to penalize schools who are doing the best that they can do to get students as far along as we possibly can, because I know everybody works really hard at doing that. That was some tough times, that No Child Left Behind Act. And that's where you begin to see, the concept of failing schools and replacing teachers with more what they would call competent teachers, and just a lot was going on during that time period. Huge push for national standards, which was then also taken up by the Obama administration, where you had, race to the top programs and increased competition. So right there, Bush and Obama were fairly alike when it came to educational policy. I left out Trump, and that was just a mistake on my part. The Trump administration still pushed for high stakes testing. That hasn't changed, but more of the privatization of education during that time period over the past few years. So certainly more interest in vouchers and charters and school choice. Man, I can't believe I left off the Trump administration there. So I apologize. Betsy DeVos wasn't my favorite education secretary, so that's probably as much wise anyway. So you had, honestly, with Becky DeVos, you had somebody who'd given millions of dollars to the Republican Party, huge school choice advocate out of Michigan, who led the school choice movement in Michigan, became education secretary, and again, that whole push for privatization continued through the Trump administration. And now you got President Biden, and I don't know what's going to happen with the Biden administration with education, but some of the things that the Biden administration has talked about is to invest in high quality early childhood education. Our own Governor Holcomb, has also moved in that direction, although again, there's still a lot of folks who don't see the necessity of childhood education, including providing universal preschool for all 3 and 4 year olds and access to affordable childcare. So we're seeing education having at the pre-K level. Also addressing the national teacher shortage by improving teacher prep programs, strengthening pipelines for underrepresented teachers, and supporting current teachers. So those are some of the initiatives the Biden administration would hope to accomplish over the next couple years that we have left in President Biden's term. And then who knows what's going to happen in 2024. Again, depending on the party in power, you'll see different objectives, different priorities, and so forth. Still probably will end up, school lunch program, Title I, special education. Those things aren't going to change, but some of the, the nuts and bolts and the just little pieces here and there might change as we continue this difference in education policy between GOP and the Democrats. Although the one thing that hasn't really changed too much is the idea of increased competition among schools and having school choice and so forth. I think that's probably going to continue. The voucher programs, after the courts have ruled that the voucher programs are legal, and because the money in the court's view is going to the family and not to the individual school districts. Dr. Schaefer's written some articles on that with respect to, like in Indiana, over 90, I think I've already said this before, 98% are going to religious institutions in terms of the voucher program. So is there a separation of church and state issue going on? But we have a conservative court now, so my guess would be no. And as we move forward, that's just going to continue. So what is the federal interest in education from historical background? We've already talked about this a little, but the Northwest Ordinance of 1785 and 87 contained a provision to give land to towns for schools. Okay, so at least the thought of providing an education has always been a part of our national character, going back before the Constitution and before the Bill of Rights. The Morrill Acts of the 1800s provided land grants to establish universities in each state. And so That's true of Indiana as well. The GI Bill post-World War II provided education benefits for veterans. It's coming out of World War II. You've had the National Defense Act, which was a Cold War initiative that providing funding for science, math, and foreign language programs. Again, that's coming out of the 1960s when we had that race for space, and oh my gosh, Sputnik. That scared the heck out of Americans and out of our in terms of national security. And oh my gosh, what are the Russians going to do next? Nothing much. That hasn't changed much over the last 50 years. So it's always us against the commies, so to speak. So and we continue that. Of course, now we have a war in Europe, and again, it's the U.S. on one side and the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, on the other, with the Russians. So we're still fighting these Cold War battles, 50, 60 years later. And then you have the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Again, good old LBJ, increased federal funding for education, focused on special education and a focus on children in poverty. So as a result, the federal government, they dole out money from time to time, right? And one of the ways that they do that is through federal categorical aid. And so since the mid-20th century, categorical aid has been the funding mechanism of choice for federal aid to education. So remember, for a specific purpose, and at least 3 conditions accompany federal categorical aid programs. First, federal aid must supplement, not supplant, state and local funding. So when you talk to your special ed directors from time to time, and in my case, we were in a special ed co-op, we had to be very careful that we were supplementing and not supplanting. And you'll see that too. And I think in your first or second application, when it talks about you're getting a grant, some people want to take the money away from the budget and say, okay, so we're going to plug in this money, but it's in addition to the budget. So because if not, you would run into supplanting issues. You would just be substituting the federal money for the local and state money. So suddenly the local and state people, they don't have to do as much fiscal effort because you got this federal money. And the federal government generally says, no. We're not talking that you can reduce your fiscal effort. You still got to provide what you've always provided, but now you can supplement, you can add something more than what you've previously done. Okay, so always keep that in mind. When you're talking about grants, you're going to sometimes from the federal government, you get these supplanting issues. You cannot supplant dollars. You still have to do as much as you've always done, but now you've got a little bit more. And so that's why you also want to be careful as you're budgeting that when you get federal aid, and I'm sure that's going to be true of the pandemic, that you don't create what we call, these real technical terms, a funding cliff, all right? Where you've taken federal dollars and you've created these new positions because you can't supplant, right? You can supplement. And now the federal aid's going to fall away and you're going, okay, now who's going to pay for all this? Well, I'll tell you who's going to pay for it. It's going to fall back on state or local communities to fund these new positions, which is why many superintendents, when they get grant funds, they won't use it in personnel. They'll use it for one-time expenditures so that they don't create a funding cliff for themselves. So if you have a school corporation right now that's using federal money for positions, a key question is, how are you going to fund those positions when the federal aid falls away? So there might be a question for you to think about as you're looking at budgets and how things are being paid for at your district level. So there must be a maintenance of funding effort by localities and states. And I would always meet with my special ed co-op director and we would talk about that maintenance of effort. And basically the easiest way to remember this, and there can be some strings and some allowances and so forth, but let's just say you spent $100 on special education, right? The next year, you cannot spend $99 or $98 or $97. You have to spend at least $100 and hopefully $101, $102. And then, so you have to maintain what you have previously spent. And so sometimes maintenance of effort issues will come up. Like, for example, you have a teacher at the top of the pay scale who's retired in special education, and then you hire a first-year teacher who's now, you've gone from $65,000 in salary to 32. So you got to be able to explain why your maintenance of effort is different. And there's some hoops to jump through and documents and paperwork, but maintenance of effort is really, really important when we're talking about federal dollars. There also must be comparability. You have to show that areas that's funded by federal aid in one school shouldn't be state aid in another school, right? So there's some strings attached when we're talking about categorical aid. There's also federal block grants. Now, what federal block grants, that's a lot easier to deal with. They're related to a categorical approach, but there's a lot greater discretion on how the money can be spent. So categorical are lots of strings attached. Federal block grants say, okay, you can use it for this like purpose over here, but we're going to give you a lot more flexibility. So they're like a middle ground between general aid and categorical aid. Categorical aid, most strings attached. Federal block grants, less, but still could have some, but generally a specific purpose, but gives you more flexibility. General aid, hey, have fun, right? And it's not quite have fun, but a very, 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 very few strings attached. And you don't get general aid packages very often. Notice here, general aid involves a general expression of purpose or priority, applies less accountability, reporting, and evaluation, and general aid has not yet been authorized by congressional action. So you're not going to see any general aid coming out of the federal government. And I don't see that happening anytime soon. They want to know if you're getting they're getting bang for their buck, and want again have strings attached in order for you to get that funding. So again, talking about LBJ, some of the biggest categorical funding programs are the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. It was amended in 2001. It's been reauthorized in 2015. Contains 8 titles, with Title I being the largest federal assistance program to schools. It provides services to more than 90% of school districts and approximately 52,000 schools. We've had 25 authorizations of appropriations. Appropriations are your ability to spend for each year from FY 2017 through 2020, ranging from $24.2 billion to $25.7 billion. It's a lot of money. Sorry, the print's a little small, but just to kind of give you some of the rationale on the 8 titles. You've got Title I, which is the most important one in this particular case, proves the academic, hopefully improves the academic achievement of the disadvantaged. These are the Title I dollars, again, to supplement funding, not to supplant local and state funding. Title II is preparing and training and recruiting high quality teachers, principals, other school leaders. I've used Title II funds. A lot of times you'll see Title II funds being used for professional development. Title III is language instruction for English learners. In Indiana, unless you're a school corporation that just has a really large population of English language learners, you're not going to get a lot of Title III money. Title IV money is a large block grant program. I've not seen Title IV money being used a whole lot. Again, it might be something that you want to ask your business manager. Hey, do we use Title IV for anything? Title V is to allow states and districts the flexibility to target federal funds to the programs and activities that most effectively address the unique needs of states and localities. Again, Title V money. I didn't really use a lot of Title V money. Now, again, I retired in 2017, and I'm not for sure in terms of the pandemic funding that's occurred since that time. If like Title IV, Title V is used a whole lot. Title VI is funding for Indian, Native, Hawaiian, Alaskan Native education. Obviously, in Indiana, we don't use Title VI a lot, if any at all. Title VII is to assist local districts that have lost property tax revenue to the presence of tax-exempt federal property. So what the heck does that mean? That would be like if you've got Grissom Air Force Base. Okay, so there might be some impact aid there. So if there's federal dollars that's causing you, or I'm sorry, federal localities, installations, so forth, you might have a proving ground. You could have an Air Force base, whatever it is that causing you to lose revenue, right? Because you're not going to get the assessed value from there. So Title VII money could, depending on just where you're at. And then you've got Title VIII, which is general provisions. The ones that you really got to know, honestly, for here is Title I is really, really important. Title II will come up quite often. And some of you will see some Title III dollars. You also have IDEA, and we're all familiar with that. It was originally enacted in 1975 as Education for All Handicapped Children's Act. The appropriation in 2017, which is the latest figure that I think your textbook has, and the latest figure that I was able to find was $12 billion, provides a free and appropriate education, better known as FAPE, right, to over 6.6 million children with disabilities, ages 3 to 21. Education must be based on an IEP, an individualized education program, which many of you already know, delivered in the least restrictive environment. So what's best for the child. To be eligible for assistance under IDEA Part B, children must require special education and related services as a result of their disability, and must be in one of the 8, or it must be in one of the special education categories listed in the legislation, and there are more than 8, I believe. So yeah, so you've got autism, deafness, emotional disturbance, hearing impaired, intellectual disability, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairment, specific learning disability, traumatic brain injury, visual impairment. I know we've got a lot of special education folks in the class, and you folks would know a heck of a lot more than I would, even though I was a superintendent, because what did I do? I went to my special education director and I said, we got X number of dollars, and so how are we going to spend it, right? So their job was to provide me with recommendations and tell me what I'm supposed to do. And you'll see that when you're a school superintendent, you're going to wear all these different hats, but you're not going to be an expert in each of these individual categories. And that's okay. And if you're building principal, you're not going to be an expert at each of these individual categories, but you're going to have your special education teachers and your special education director, and like in my case, the co-op, who's going to help you navigate this, but still have an understanding. I'm not going to, put this on a test. Hey, what are the 10 Individuals Disabilities Act categories that I had on this particular PowerPoint? Okay, that's not going to happen. But understand that there are these categories, and know some of the terminology that's being used and so forth, and have an understanding, that autism is a category and so forth. Okay, this is just for your general information, but as a superintendent, do you have to know every one of these? No, I would be fibbing to you if I said that you did. I relied on my special education director. Now, I knew enough to be dangerous, and I knew enough between IDEA and Section 504, which could be for other health impaired students, to know that, okay, they're not going to qualify in IDEA, but are they going to qualify in Section 504? So, you have to be aware of your different categories and where funding's going. And special ed, Section 504, you don't get any funding for, but you still have to provide educational services. So whereas IDEA, you got funding behind it, which is great, never enough. You also had the Race to the Top program in 2009. Again, this is where the Obama administration, a Democrat, really pushed the idea of school choice and competitiveness between districts in order to get dollars. Awarded points to states based on the rigor of reforms promoted and the compatibility with 4 administration priorities. Notice what they were under the Obama administration. Adopting common standards and assessments. So testing was very, very big under the Obama administration. Creating better student data systems. And that's when you saw a lot of these subcategories coming out and testing making sure each of these subcategories, which also tied back into the Bush administration to make sure no child got left behind. Creating teacher evaluation and retention policies. And you've seen both Republicans and Democrats tie teacher evaluation back to student test scores, which is never a good thing. And then adopting selected school turnaround strategies so that we began again to not leave any child behind. And if you had failing schools, what were you going to do about that? STEM also became a huge focus during this time period, and states that showed compatibility with these priorities, they received higher ratings and Race to the Top dollars, right? You're the best state, so we're going to give you more money in terms of meeting these priorities. So the Obama administration, again, a Democrat, pushed many of the priorities that we still see today in the GOP agenda in education as well. So we're a lot closer between Democrats and Republicans on education policy than we are on some of the other issues that are, that separate our country. Now, recently, with the cultural wars, we're starting to see more of a break between Republican and Democrat priorities, okay? Because you've got some GOP states that are doing things, like talking about banning books and CRT issues, and which there's no evidence that's happening in public schools outside of that. You might have a rogue actor out there in terms of a teacher doing that, but there's no curriculum from state curriculum standpoint or local curriculum that are doing some of the things that states and schools and corporations are being accused of. Can you have a bad actor who might be, and in terms of bad actor, I mean teaching something outside of the state curriculum? Yes, but you always have had that, right? But so we're seeing some disagreements now between the GOP and the Democrats, but in terms of these sorts of items, common assessment standards, so forth, better data systems, teacher evaluations, those we had a lot of consensus really from the Clinton administration all the way through the Trump administration, and then we'll see where Biden is. There's a lot of common ground on school choice and competition among schools and tying and having a national standards and tying teacher performance back to student test scores. There's been a lot of common ground between the Democrats and Republicans. As we've already talked about, what are the mechanisms for funding federal programs? We've got under ESEA formula grants, IDEA formula grants, and Race to the Top was a competitive grant program. So there are ways to get dollars out to the states and thus back into your school corporations and into your local community. Some other grants that you may hear about are the Carl D. Perkins Career and Technical Education Grant. You'll hear your career and technical folks talking about Carl Perkins a lot. So it's support of technical education, which dates back to even 1862 and 1890. So we're start out as agrarian society, and so and apprenticeships and so forth through our history. And so you're going to see that still focus on career and technical education. Federal support for technical education was separated and renamed the Carl D. Perkins Career and Technical Education Act in 1984. Again, it's a formula funding. based on the state's average per capita income and the size of its population. And notice that 85% of funding has to be directed to the local level. So you don't need to know too many of the particulars here outside of the fact that this is where a lot of your CTE money will come from at the federal level. Notice that for federal expenditures for education, most funding for the U.S. Department of Education is discretionary, and so it's going to be appropriated annually by Congress. All right, so you're going to see some fights going on at the federal level between how much money goes into the U.S. Department of Education. The Trump administration's budget request for the Department of Education was a significant decrease from the Obama administration. And the goal of the Trump administration was to reduce the federal government's role in K through 12 education. So you had Betsy DeVos there. Her goal was to reduce federal influence. Now with the Biden administration, now we're seeing the reversal, that we want to see a larger impact of, or larger involvement of the federal government in K through 12 education. Other federal agencies that administer funding for primary and secondary education include the Department of Agriculture, which coordinates the funding for child nutrition programs, Department of Health and Human Services, which supports, hold on here, I got a phone call, which supports Department of Health. Hold on here. Department of, I lost my train of thought with that phone call. So you have the Department of Agriculture, which coordinates the funding for the child nutrition program, Department of Health and Human Services, which supports the Head Start program, and the Department of Labor, which supports youth employment and training activities. So just know that, you know, there's other agencies. Again, we've got this alphabet soup of agencies that are supporting education at the federal level. So what are some of the advantages and disadvantage of federal involvement? Well, the further you get away from the educational process, the further you get away from the classroom, generally the less effective it is, right? And we see that, you know, superintendent, sometimes you'll hear teachers say the superintendent, you know, he doesn't know what I'm doing in my individual classrooms, which sometimes can be true, right? And so think about the federal government. These people in Washington, D.C., they don't have a clue as to what your needs might be in that individual classroom or then district, school corporation, so forth. So by design, the involvement is limited. You know, so you have to focus on things that you think you can get most bang for your buck, like child nutrition, poverty, special education. Okay. You're not going to reach down and get into those individual classrooms, which is why there's never been a real agreement on having a national curriculum, because every state, every locality is different. Graduate income tax or the effective source of a lot of that revenue. And, you know, we have I have a very limited understanding of federal budgeting. I'm better at the local and at the state, a little bit better. Federal, fairly limited outside of these categorical grants. And really as individuals who want to end up being principals and superintendents, that's okay. You're going to have limited understanding in federal budgeting. And you're only going to be concerned primarily with your Title I and special education and school lunch programs. Advantages and disadvantages continue. Federal government should maintain a position of neutrality. And I think they've, for the most part, but again, it depends on from one administration to the next, how involved and how neutral the government's going to be. Categorical funding, which is bound by many regulations, including, and this is the most important, it's to supplement what you're doing and not supplant what you're doing. Nobody wants you to see you reduce your fiscal effort in a budget. Block grants, again, are a middle ground between categorical funding and general aid. In general aid, there are very few restrictions, but we don't see congressional authorization for general aid at the present time. So what about the future? What's going to happen in the future with federal programs? We must not permit state expenditures to be reduced. Again, I'm beating you over the head with this. It's to supplement and not supplant fiscal effort at the local level and state level. It's not to be reduced. It's to add more to, but as a result, if you're not careful, superintendents out there, principals out there, so forth, you can create fiscal cliffs if you hire people and create positions through these dollars that are eventually going to be gone. Then you got to determine how you're going to handle those positions. So sometimes it's better, and teachers and the community may be shaking their head, getting all this money, but you're not hiring more staff. Well, the reason is generally because you don't want to create fiscal cliffs for yourself. Funding should be based on the principle of equalization, and funding should support the national interest. So that's federal involvement in education. Again, limited, but very, very important. Okay. Hey, everybody have a great day. We have made it through another chapter. Take care. God bless, and we will talk soon.